Recording in progress.
Hello and welcome back for the final lesson in our series, Colossians, Christ in You, the Hope of Glory. And today we are in the last lesson, lesson 10, which is Paul's final greetings and conclusion. And we're going to look back through the book and see if we can kind of solidify in our minds what it is that Colossians actually says. You know, if you had asked me before we started this series, what does Colossians say? Then I had a couple of points I could remember, but I want to remember more of the richness that we have encountered as we've gone through the book so in depth. And so I think we're going to spend some time on that today. But first, let's do a quick review of our last lesson. It's been a couple of weeks since we had Thanksgiving and service day in between, but we looked at Paul's kind of final bit of instructions and a lot of his greeting. We did chapter 4, verse 2 is where we started. So what stood out to you? What did you find in that section?
To devote yourselves to prayer, and especially to be thankful.
Yeah.
Steadfast.
And okay. So stay devoting alert. To prayer, being thankful, steadfast. Yeah. Yeah.
Stay alert.
Stay alert. Yes, we had that in our Sunday sermon. Didn't that stand out to you? Same word. Same word. Yeah, that alertness that you're watching for. What do we watch? What do we alert for?
False teaching.
False teaching, that shows up in Colossians. What else? Maybe our ways to grow into maturity. And always alert for the next coming, you know, the final coming of our Lord. Opportunities, right? What does Paul say about opportunities in this passage?
Well, he wanted God's will to be done on earth, and there were opportunities to preach that and to teach that.
Yes. So he wanted prayer for his opportunities, and then he told them to make the most of every opportunity in doing what? How you act towards outsiders. Yeah. So those without, or those who are outside of the community of Christ, this family that has been formed in the love of Jesus, right? And so he has instructions for them to be full of grace, to be seasoned with salt. And we talked about that, you know, that there should be some spark in what we have to say about who Jesus is and the news about, you know, that he loves us. This is good news, and it should come across not as a down news, but as an up news, right? Seasoned with salt. And then answering everyone out of the character that imitates Jesus.
And be supportive of those that are new Christians.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Good point. What else? What else stood out to you?
Everyone should be created equally.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to hit that definitely as we go through our whole outline, because he talked about the equality between Jew and Greek, slave and free, you know, definitely. Yeah, so that comes earlier rather than in this final passage, and that is a really important point out of Colossians.
And Christ is sufficient.
And the sufficiency of Christ. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Okay, so this very last bit, we got a lot of names. On Wednesday night, I remembered to read that myself instead of subjecting all those names onto somebody else. Thank you. You did great. Sorry. But no, it was, you know, we don't actually pronounce those the way they would have. Even the audio Bible does not necessarily pronounce them the way they would have. So it is all good. But yeah, Paul made his personal greetings, and we saw how personal his message really was, right? It's not abstract. You can't love people in the abstract. You have to love them like with their flaws and with their quirks and in person and with the situations that we're really in. And we kind of saw that coming through. Well, let's read today's passage. It's just 3 verses, or it's 4 verses. Let's read 15 through 18. Colossians 4, 15 through 18. Would somebody do that?
Okay.
Okay, good.
Give my greetings to the brothers in Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. After this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of Laodicea, and all you in turn read this letter from Laodicea. Tell Hippias, see to it that you do the work that you received in the Lord. I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be to you.
Okay, so short little passage. Thank you very much. And yet there really is quite a bit in this. What are Paul's final instructions? Verse 15. What are they supposed to do? Salute the brethren in Laodicea, right? So Laodicea, does anyone remember where that is compared to Colossae?
8 miles away, maybe.
8-10, yes, yeah, it's close. It's a day's walk, you know. It is their closest sister town, and so he says to greet them. And who else? And Tychicus actually, we talked about Tychicus back in verse 7, but he may have carried a letter to Laodicea at the same time from Paul, except we don't know because sadly we do not have that letter. That bothers me. I want to have that letter. So we don't have a letter to Laodicea. Some scholars have theorized that the letter to Ephesians is the letter he's talking about, but it really doesn't make sense, and it has not caught on because it just doesn't really fit. But Tychicus had this letter. He had the letter to Philemon. He probably had the letter to Ephesus at the same time, because if we look at the end of Ephesus, it says, Tychicus, the dear brother and faithful servant in the Lord, will tell you everything so that you may know how I am and what I'm doing. Okay, that sounds very familiar, right? That's just like Colossians 4:7. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. So probably he had all these multiple letters, and Tychicus is mentioned in some other books too, but not quite like so obviously he's the guy with the letters, you know. So that's probably how they're reading the letter from Laodicea and doing that exchange. Who else does Paul mention in verse 15? Okay, you have Nymphas, and she read, what do you all have? The rest of you? You have Nymphas? Nympha. Okay. Nympha is a woman's name. Nymphas is a man's name.
But it does say, after this letter has been read to you, where it is. It said, in her house. Nympha and the church in her house.
Mine
So
says
she
his
had
house.
Yours says his house. Yes. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about this, right? This is interesting, isn't
I love
it? What's that?
I love it that there was a woman who had church in her house.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it her or is it his? This is a controversy. Y'all have spotted it, right? Okay, so first of all, is Nympha in Laodicea? The way this is written, we can't quite tell. It could mean the word "and" to Nympha could mean that is to Nympha and the church in her house. So it's not entirely clear if this is the church at Laodicea, if it's one of the churches in Laodicea, or possibly does he mean the church of Laodicea and also the church wherever Nympha is, which there's a small Roman spa town nearby called Hierapolis. They have hot springs. And so it's like, you know,
Arkansas.
yeah, like Hot Springs, Arkansas used to be, where they had a spa there because of the hot springs. Same thing in Hierapolis. So it could be that Nympha is there. So we don't know if Nympha is in Laodicea or maybe just nearby. But here's what has happened. You know how in a subject we say he, she, and in the predicate we say him, her? The form changes, right? Subject and predicate. Greek does that for every single word. And there's actually 4 forms, and they all change, even proper names. So the name of someone will be spelled differently if it's in the subject or if it's in the predicate. Well, this name happens to turn into the same spelling in that, it's called the accusative is the form, in the accusative for the man's name and the woman's name. They're spelled the same if they're an object, like an object of a preposition, an object of a verb. So it was unclear. Then we get some manuscript variances that put in him instead of her, or his instead of hers. And so over time, some of those changes happened, and when the King James was translated, it got translated the man's name and the male pronoun. Now, scholars currently, this is very unusual. Y'all will not hear me say this very often. Scholars concur. Scholars agree. Amazing. Now that it should be Nympha, the woman's name, and the church in her house. So the modern translations will have the woman's name and her. And that's believed by pretty much across the board to be correct. So that's kind of an artifact of an earlier translation is what we're getting, is when you're using one of those old translations. ASV has it, and then several of the King James versions have it. Okay. So now, was that an innocent mistake, or are they erasing women leaders in the church? I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader, right? What does Paul make of the church being in a woman's house, of the church having a woman as a patron and probably a leader?
Well, he's greeting her just like he would the man.
Greeting her just like he would someone, he greets Philemon in the church in his house, right? And it sounds the exact same. Isn't that interesting? Paul makes absolutely no point about this church having a woman patron and probably leader. So I think that's very interesting. In Greco-Roman society, it was more common and more socially acceptable for a woman of standing, a woman of wealth or nobility, to have a leadership role in regular society. That was more normal. Like a lower class woman would not get that opportunity, but a higher status woman would. It was fairly common. And so Nympha clearly has a home big enough to function as a meeting place, so she must have some wealth, some standing. So it's not too surprising that she is a patron and leader in this church. Now,
I think Paul is just interested in the Christians meeting.
Yes, yeah, I think so. Some have speculated that she's a patron, but not a leader. She's only hosting. She's not a spiritual leader. There's no evidence of that. And so we need to notice that, when we look at all of the things that Paul says about women, we should notice that he greets these women leaders in the same way he would greet men. And he just cares that they're serving Jesus. And we should keep that as part of our picture of how the early church functioned with regard to men and women, right? That's at least part of the picture. Comments? Questions? Anything? Okay. Well, so why do you think they're supposed to read each other's letters? So Colossians is supposed to read Laodicea's letter, Laodicea is supposed to read Colossians' letter. What's the point of that?
encourage each other.
Encourage each other? Yeah. Yeah. How would it encourage each other?
To let them know that they're thinking about them and praying for them and they're in their thoughts.
Yeah, so it forms relationships when you get together and exchange letters, right? So that Christian support, and that idea that they would cooperate in this way. Paul is kind of setting them up for a date, right? This is a way to help them establish those encouraging relationships. What else?
Well, and it's good to know that they have support somewhere.
Yeah, what if they have questions and they can't get a hold of Paul? They have someone nearby. Yeah, support. Yeah, what else? I think, these books are not. Did you going to say something?
There could be nuances in the letters that would further inform them.
Yes, more content.
Right.
Yeah.
More explanation of something in one letter than in another.
In another. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where I was thinking. Like, these letters are not systematic, right? Paul says what he says, but he doesn't say everything. He doesn't let's start at the beginning of theology and let's get it organized and march our way through. Now, sometimes we wish he had, right? Would it be nice if we had a systematic theology from Paul? We do not. Systematic theology is a whole huge branch of study now because we don't have the version then, or maybe it would be either way. But that idea of there's different stuff in these letters because they're situational. He addresses what's going on, and so they come out different, and we learn different things from them. Yeah, that was one of the things I was thinking. Well, we have the last in verse 17. We have some instructions. What's our Archippus supposed to do?
Take heed to the ministry.
Take heed to the ministry. What else do y'all have?
See to it that you complete the work you have received and
You fulfill it.
Okay.
Fulfill it.
Get it done. Fulfill it. What's it? We do not know. Again, with stuff we don't know. We don't really know who Archippus is. He's mentioned in the opening greeting to Philemon. But so he is probably a leader. And yet we don't know what his ministry is that he's supposed to complete. What is his work? Yet completing the work, fulfilling the ministry is a major theme of Colossians, isn't it? Mm-hmm. This is part that growth towards maturity is, Paul ends like he began, wishing for them to fulfill their work in the Lord. And what's going on in the last verse?
He's reminding them that he's in bonds.
Remember my chains, remember my bonds. Yeah. What else?
And he's saluting them.
Yes.
And with his own hand.
With his own hand. Okay. So Paul, we've talked about this before. This was common in letter writing. A secretary probably wrote everything up to this point. And then Paul writes the last greeting in his own, probably poor handwriting. And it's his signature, right? It authenticates the letter. They was like, oh, yeah, that's Paul's handwriting. That authenticates the letter. And it indicates his personal attention, doesn't it? So he's reminding them to remember his chains. That's the last phrase. What are they supposed to remember? What does that mean?
Considering the whole letter, remember him in prayer.
Remember him in prayer, yeah. What else?
the chains aren't going to stop him.
Yeah, remember that the gospel is still going out. Yeah, and be encouraged by that. Yeah. What else? You remember that when Paul described his ministry, he told them, I'm suffering for you. Right? And so there is a sense that, look, for the sake of you and others like you, remember that the suffering is worth it and that you might suffer as well.
And you can still be fruitful while you're suffering.
And you can still be fruitful. Yeah, yeah. I think that's the kind of all of those things are included in this sort of parting phrase. Well, Paul has given us a lot important content, even in these last couple logistical verses, right? So, as I said, I want to be able to look back and think, yeah, I can kind of say what Colossians is about. So, let's do a little bit of an outline. Let's just break Colossians up into when I did it, I ended up with 7. So maybe 6 to 8, when we do it together, pieces to like for an outline, right? Let me see. I want to make a whiteboard.
What I like, and at the end of this chapter, the last thing he said, grace be unto you.
Yeah. Yeah. Grace be with you. Yeah. And that's how he began, isn't it? I forgot that. I forgot to talk about that. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because, it was grace and peace to you from God our Father. And then he ends with grace to you. The great gift of Jesus is the very last thing. Yeah, he wishes for them. Such a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so if you're going to look back at Colossians and kind of outline it in big chunks, what would you say?
First part would be the introduction.
Okay, that introduction, and if we, let's see.
It's a thanksgiving and prayer.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first big section is, I guess we'll call it prayer for the Colossians. It's a greeting. We'll do greeting. Greeting. And where's my... Am I spelling Colossians right? Yeah. What else? Then what? So that pretty much goes through, I don't know what, it goes through maybe 13. And then what's next?
The supremacy of Christ.
Yeah, supremacy of Christ. And this is an important piece of content, right? The theological content, but then Paul will keep picking up on it through the rest of the letter. Okay, supremacy of Christ. So I'd say that probably goes through, and then he talks about how that relates to them, and it probably all goes together, maybe through 23. Then what?
Paul's labor for the church.
Yeah, Paul's ministry itself, right? He talks about that. Oh, let's put a 3. Specifically them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What else? What's after that?
Freedom from humane. Freedom.
He's got, the NIV says freedom from human regulations. So how would y'all describe that whole section? So if we were to go from 2:6 through, the end of chapter 2 maybe, or even a little further? No, end of chapter 2, I think. How would y'all sum that up?
Be rooted in him.
Say again?
Be rooted in him.
Rooted in Christ? Yeah, what were you saying?
Freedom from regulation that they have been up under, and to live in God's love.
Yeah. He talks about, this is where he's do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, don't be taken in by that, right? What else? How else? So Paul is really addressing false teachers here, right? His opponents, people that are teaching a different gospel, right? So, I think freedom from regulations is okay, and we could call it that, but
The sufficiency of Christ.
Yeah, because the sufficiency of Christ is the reason behind what I would call a section like don't be misled by false teachers.
And don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink or and so forth.
Yeah. Because if you're submitting to that judgment, then you change your behavior to please that direction, right? So it's this idea of not allowing their judgment to cause you to be misled into these other ways that are not consistent with the gospel, right? Jesus is enough. Jesus is sufficient. You don't need these false ways of following the gospel. Yeah. Okay, so what about chapter 3? What are we doing then?
Rules for living.
Okay,
Some do's and don'ts.
some do's and don'ts. Yeah. You know, I think it's the heading rules for living that made me feel like this was going to be a really boring section. And then it didn't turn out to be boring at all. It turned out to be beautiful. Why? What's at the heart of these, of what the NIV calls rules for living? I don't want to call it that. I didn't like that. What would we say?
Well, they tell them, when I had Paul's exhortations for the Colossians.
Exhortations, okay. About holy living, right?
Faith and those kind, yeah.
Yeah. What are other ideas?
Mine says rules for Christian households.
Okay, so that would be starting in 18. And then, so the passage from 3:1 to 3:17, I want to call it, y'all can tell me if you think this is okay, this is right, but I want to call it the portrait of the Jesus follower. Because he talks about all of the things the Jesus follower is not, and we see the damage those things do. And then he talks about all the things the Jesus follower is, and they're all ways that Jesus was described. And these passages in the gospel where he's moved with compassion, or he's humble, or, you know, all of it just rang with, he's talking about how Jesus looks and that we can look that way. So what do y'all think?
I like that.
All right. Portrait.
I think it also has to do with warnings.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Jesus follower isn't some of these other things. Yeah. There are definitely some strong warnings about ways not to be. Yeah. All right. So then now let's look at verse 18. So I sort of think that's a little bit of a continuation of the portrait of the Jesus follower, but it's like, now apply it even in household structures, existing power dynamics, you know? Which is hard. That's hard to do.
Yeah.
You know, and you can tell by the way Paul writes it that he's walking kind of a thin line between saying, like, none of these power structures matter, and Jesus is at the heart of everything, and getting in trouble with the Romans, right? So yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, and then how are we going to wrap it up? Maybe starting verse 4:2. Maybe just
Continue, it says continue in prayer and
Okay.
watching, the same with Thanksgiving, so.
yeah, prayer, and then he finishes up with all of his greetings again. So we begin and end with greetings because after all, it is a letter. And so we kind of have like this structure that we can use to remember what's in Colossians, maybe these 7 big topics. All right, let's look back at a couple of things. What do you think are the most important points or most important passages as we go through.
Like, that supremacy of Christ.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing, is that he's sufficient.
Yes, and there's a lot of really good theology in there, isn't there? So there's like that we talked quite a bit about how this passage talks about Jesus as fully God and fully man, and how that matters when you get in deep into understanding, what it is that Jesus did for us. Fully God and fully man. And then someone else said sufficiency. We talked about Jesus holding all things together. What else? In that supremacy of Christ.
Also, he speaks about false teachers and warning them against false teachers and to be in prayer and watchful for each other so they do not become into temptation.
Yeah, that false teacher section is pretty interesting that way, isn't it? Kind of, and there's a really, even though he's talking about false teachers, he weaves in important theology in there as well. Look at verse 2, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, and then 15. For in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form, and you have been given fullness in Christ. This is going straight along with supremacy of Christ, isn't it? Even though it's in the next section. Who is the head over every power and authority, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. What an important passage. And it leads us to this, one of the things in supremacy of Christ, which is the victory over powers and authorities. And that shows up over and over again in this book, doesn't it? They don't have to worry about the false teachers. They don't have to worry about their current society, even though it seems like they're on the outside. They actually are on the winning side, that the others are on the outside and they need to invite them in, right? So that victory over powers and authorities. And then finally, I guess I would put in there reconciling all things to God, right?
And that's where the support for each other comes from in the letters that they're passing back and forth.
Yeah, out of their salvation. Yes. So they have this new community, which I realized when Shirley said it, I picked out some of the most important verses, but really, here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all, is one of the most important verses, and I forgot about it. So that idea of that community is made real because of that unity in reconciliation with God. Yeah, what a great point.
What verse is that?
Here, there's no Greek or Jew. It is 3:11.
Thank you.
And it's actually in the portrait of the Jesus follower. And it seems like it's coming out of left field, but you're right. It fits exactly. Let me just, 3:11. No Greek, agreed, Greek or Jew. That passage. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing, what that's in that in the Paul's ministry for them is that whole idea about the mystery, right? Wasn't that interesting? So yes, he's talking about, hey, I've been working for the whole church. But when we hear what he means by that, sorry, my internet connection is unstable. When we hear what he means by that, it's that he's able to unveil this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. So that was one of the key verses that I had picked out, 127. To the saints, so, to us, we can apply to ourselves. He says to them, but he's talking about the saints. God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. This is Paul's kind of mission statement, right? Particularly important.
He was in chains, and so therefore he was able to minister like to the jailers, to the people, the prisoners, the people that were in prison also.
Yeah, his suffering in the way of Jesus has furthered his ministry. And he talks about the jailers in Philippians, and I think, we can apply it here as well, rightly, because his suffering is what has made his testimony. Yeah.
And they become a part of the community.
Yes, that community. Yeah.
3:17 stands out to me.
Okay.
And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Yes. Yeah.
In the name of Jesus.
Yeah, I kind of even want to put that in the in section 6, because I think I sort of wonder if it actually goes as a header to that household thing, but it's a hinge. It's really part of both. That idea of everything in the name of Jesus. And this is a major theme of Colossians, that Jesus, how would I spell Jesus right? That Jesus changes everything. He has overcome the powers of the world. The reality that you think even just the basic reality of who's in charge, has been completely turned upside down and made new by Jesus. And that's sort of one of the things that ties the whole book together. Everything is new in Jesus.
And it's enough.
Yeah. Let's write down a couple of major themes. Uh-oh, I'm running out of space. I think I just can make everything just a tiny bit smaller if I know how to do that. Do I know how to do that?
There you go.
Well, we're not going to have room for more themes. Maybe I'll make a new box of themes. Then I want technology. Why is it so hard all the time? No, it doesn't tell me how to make it smaller. I should have thought of that.
Can you just raise it on up?
Maybe so, and we just won't see the top right now. We'll see it later. Yeah, let's do that. Okay. What else?
There you go. Whoops.
Everything is new in Jesus. What next? So, and what else strikes you as important in the book, and then we'll pull themes out of that as we go. We didn't talk about this when we talked about that section, but I really think 113 is super amazing. Someone read 113 for us.
Who has delivered us from the power of darkness and has translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son?
Keep going. One more verse, I think.
In whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins.
Yeah. It's kind of the definition, the definition of salvation there, right? Out of the dominion of darkness, that rescue, and the just the concept of evil as, you know, sin, and not as good stuff we're not allowed to do, but as like darkness, toxic, corrosive things that wreck our life, and into the kingdom of Jesus. Yeah, his beloved son. Yeah. What else, y'all?
All things created by him and for him.
All things by him and for him. That sort of this sort of fully God and fully man and holding all things together concept. So important.
One thing we talked about in class was maturity that we haven't mentioned.
Yes. And I
Maturity in
think
Christ.
that is really prevalent, right? It keeps coming back to kind of a living, becoming like Jesus in fullness and maturity, and the life that leads to. Yeah, walking. So many times, you know, our translation obscured it, and I had to say, well, this is literally walk in this way, and that came up over and over again. So maturity. Yeah, definitely. What else? You know, the verse that sticks out to me in that theme is in 3:1-4, and this is one of my favorite verses in the whole book, although I have several. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. Remember how we talked about Christ was hidden, the mystery was hidden, but now we are hidden, meaning we will be revealed. Right? Just as Christ was revealed, we will be revealed. So he says, when Christ, who is your life, appears, when he comes again, then you will appear, be revealed with him in glory. This is what the life of Christian maturity leads to, is that completion in Jesus in glory. Yeah.
There's a lot of theology packed into these 4 chapters.
There really is, and some of it's in the practical sections, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what does that tell us? Like, that's an important point, that it's like the theology isn't one thing to do when we study, and then the practical life is something to do otherwise.
It's possible to do it.
And it's possible, that idea.
Informs your life.
It informs your life. It's all intertwined. These are interwoven together. The truth about Jesus and the actual nature of Christ and the nature of salvation is practical, because it's what makes us walk in him and grow into maturity. Yeah. And then y'all mentioned, and I didn't write it down, but y'all, gratitude. Thankfulness. Like, what a repeated idea in this, you know, that has to be part of how we become mature practically, because he mentions it over and over. It's in 1:3, he talks about thanking God for them, you know, those are his partners in Christian faith. I'll write this list down for you in just a minute. In 1:12, be thankful for our inheritance, our new life in Jesus. In 2:7, he talks about how gratitude is part of our foundation in Christ and part of our growth. In 3:15, he says gratitude will help us maintain the peace of Christ even when we're having to forgive people, right? When we don't get along and we have to forgive people and we have to work those things out that are difficult, because people are difficult, gratitude is part of what helps us, right? And then 3:16, he mentions it again, as part of our foundation of worship, right? This is part of what we do in worship is thankfulness, gratitude. And then in 4:2, being thankful in prayer and alertness. Yeah, so many good ways, but this has to be part of what we know about how to become mature is to be grateful. 3:16, 3:17. It's dense in there with the gratitude, right? And then ending up with 4:2, 7 mentions over the course of Colossians. Yeah. Well, any other takeaways from this book? What will you do differently because of this really wonderful book of Colossians?
Patience.
What's that?
Be patient.
Being patient, yeah. Okay. And Paul is really patient in here, isn't he? He is in chains, but you get that sense of his willingness to slowly nurture this new body of believers to maturity. Yeah.
Be thankful for small things.
Thankful for small things is so, it could be cliche, but only because it's true,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, that gratitude, thankful. I like this idea of how our theology is really woven in with everything we practice. And if we're being, okay, what is it that we're not supposed to be, right? If we're being angry or anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language, all of those things, those do not fit with who Jesus is or who I am in Jesus. Like it all works together.
You can't have that and a thankful heart.
And it's a good point. Yeah, it's not consistent with a thankful heart. So allowing that gratitude to push out the rest.
I think the maturity of what you say or how you answer people in 4:6.
Yeah, be ready to answer.
Mhm.
Yeah, that takes maturity,
Even when
doesn't it?
wrong.
Yeah. Doesn't mean you have to have all the answers, right? It's how, you would want to give an answer, but sometimes the answer would just be a word of love. You might not know the answers to every question, and that's okay
I'm
too.
always putting my foot in my mouth. It's really good for me.
Well, thank you so much for being part of this study. Your comments and participation are really what makes it rich and what makes it good. And I know a lot of you are like me in that we have just really fallen in love with this material. It's been so, so rich. Our new series will be The Servant King, the poetry of Isaiah 40 to 55. This is the third section of Isaiah, and in which we see God's message of hope for Israel after exile, and the servant who will bring in the life of the new age. Haven't we talked about the life of the new age in Colossians? This is exactly the kind of prophetic prediction that we're getting, is that the life of the new age is coming in Isaiah. And there will be a new creation, and all of God's servants and all the nations will be blessed by it. So I hope you're looking forward to that, as I am, and we begin January 9th and 10th.
Great job. Wow.
Well, we have plenty of time to do everything.
We do.
What can I help Sandy with this out?
Pardon me?
What can I help to do with this out?
It's done.
It's done.
Thank
We
you.
can just.
Well, we have a prayer request prayer, or no?
We were going to just do that.
Oh, do that in there. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Are there any new prayer requests? Okay. Well, Jeff is going to lead our prayer before lunch. So I think we can just kind of mosey on up.
Wonderful job.